What I would say that sort of makes the Anglosphere unique is not so much like its pace of democratisation, but its political culture.
Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. In the early 20th century, Australia's leaders entertained an ambitious idea that the self-governing nations of the British Empire might one day form something closer to a political union, an imperial federation, capable of defending and extending what they saw as the world's most successful democratic civilization. It was a vision shaped by Australian Prime Ministers like Alfred Deakin and Robert Menzies, a belief that shared institutions, traditions and habits of government could bind geographically disparate nations together. From the spread of the secret ballot to the evolution of the welfare state, these Anglosphere nations of Australia, the US, Canada and the UK have often functioned as a kind of laboratory of democratic innovation. But rather than be bound more closely as Deakin and Menzies had wished, the two world wars loosened rather than strengthened our ties, and the British Commonwealth evolved into something far more diffuse. As we look across the Anglosphere today, and it's a region with almost 500 million people, we observe declining trust in institutions, falling party memberships, and rising political polarisation. So the question returns, was something lost in that drift apart between our nations? But more interestingly, might something be gained if we reconsider coming closer together? Well, my guest today, Dr. Jesse Clark, is an Australian political scientist. He's based in Denver, so he's spreading himself around the Anglosphere, and he takes precisely this long view. So, Jesse, welcome to Afternoon Light.
Thank you, Georgina.
It's a fascinating thought that we might be able to come closer together as political systems to our mutual benefit across the Anglosphere. The Anglosphere, though, as a term, is a bit contested. It sort of rose to prominence, I think, about 15 years ago. I always think Tony Abbott was a big fan of the Anglosphere, former Australian Prime Minister. As a British politician, Daniel Hannan, he's a huge fan of the Anglosphere.
James Bennett, yes.
Yeah. So there are people who use the term, like the term, but there are also people who really don't like the term and see it as a kind of a throwback to a bygone era British Empire, and we need to move beyond that. We're now part of Asia or wherever. So how do you characterise the term Anglosphere and well, I guess, do you like it? You obviously do,
I do like it. Listen, it's a term that, brings together nations that are part of a common civilizational tree. We all have these British roots that go back even before 1066. And, a lot of our culture and our reactions to events are shaped by those earlier generations and institutions and sort of like cultural fragments that came out of that. So we all exist within this tree. We're different branches, and some of them came about earlier and are longer. Others are broke away or became more independent later on and maybe are shorter. But we all exist within this same ecosystem. There's a lot of cross-cultural pollination between our countries. I would say we just got trying to define the scope of the Anglosphere. You can imagine it as like different concentric circles, right? So at the very center of the Anglosphere, we would probably have the Kanzak nations. These are the countries that have the greatest similarity. They have King Charles III as their head of state. They all have common law. They have all sort of like evolved these parliamentary systems and institutions. And they were the ones that stayed in the empire and connected to the empire longest. Obviously the American colonies broke away significantly earlier, but even they remained very connected with the rest of the Anglosphere. So if we take another look at like another ring out, we find countries like Ireland, the United States, and English-speaking Caribbean countries. And then if we go out again, we find countries like South Africa, maybe India, countries that weren't settler colonies originally, and so haven't had as much, cultural interaction or dissemination into those countries, but still have more links to the core Anglosphere than, say, I don't know, like a Germany or a Ukraine. So I guess that's, it's a nebulous term. Sometimes people look at it, very broadly, and they'll include South Africa in it. Other times they look very narrowly. I tend to use Kanzuk when only referring to, the very core, so Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK, and Anglosphere when I refer to those countries plus the United States, plus Ireland and English-speaking Caribbean countries and, Guyana. So, yeah, I guess that's the scope of it.
Yeah. And look, these countries all are, as you say, they're all democracies, they're parliamentary democracies. Not all of them have the Westminster system, so that's where there's a divergence.
And actually, we don't have the Westminster system either in Australia.
Oh, yes, we have a Washminster.
We have a Washminster system, exactly. And it's become far more presidential since, we went through all of those prime ministers from 2007 through to Albanese. We went through what was like 8 different changes and both parties made it more difficult to replace their leaders while in office. So to get rid of Albanese, the Labour caucus needs 75% in support of that. In the Liberal Party, I believe it's 2/3. But what that ultimately means is that the House of Representatives acts almost like an electoral college for the Prime Minister, who is essentially like a president. And they choose their cabinet, and then they negotiate their legislation through the real legislature, the real legislative body, which is a Senate in the Australian system. The House is almost really just about theatre and, debate, and it allows for, an understanding of what's going on with question time and so forth. But the Australian system actually works a lot like the American model when you think about it a certain way.
It's interesting, these ideas around an imperial federation that Alfred Deakin spoke about in the very early 20th century. He was president of the Victorian branch of the Imperial Federation League. And Australia's federation is often seen as a first step before we reached an imperial federation.
And Canada's as well.
And in the 30s and 40s, Menzies became a strong advocate of the Commonwealth having a sort of a one-voice approach to international affairs, which almost sort of reeks of the European Union as its ambition was in the 50s when it was founded. So I'm really interested in these early ideas around, the Anglosphere, of which Australia was part of, especially, Kanzuk, if we conceive of it that way, that they were part of a democratic civilization and that they could come together to showcase to the world the success of their democracy, but not in aspic, but as an evolving democratic project too.
Yes. This idea definitely does date back to sort of the late 19th, early 20th century, before World War I. World War I really threw a spanner in the works. I often think, what would the world be like if the UK had remained neutral during World War I? Honestly, I think it probably was a big mistake. If they had concentrated on solidifying their empire, making it more democratic and federal in nature rather than imperial, I think we might be in a better position now to deal with the various challenges confronting us: AI, global warming, populism, threats to democracy, and this multipolar, quite dangerous world with a rising China and a resurgent and aggressive Russia. So, it's an interesting, thought experiment. What would have happened if we had not gone to World War I? But we did. And that did stoke nationalism in the various realms and the various dominions. And I mean, if we look at Canada, conscription was a huge issue among the French Canadian population. And coming out of World War I, coming out of that experience, there was this realization from English-speaking Canada that we needed, a little bit more autonomy from imperial policy to try to keep our country together. In Australia and New Zealand, there was just this sense of nationhood that came out of Gallipoli and the Anzac myth. But yeah, it's an interesting period. And it was so fundamental to what happened in the 20th century. I would say even more fundamental than World War II. What's often overlooked in history books is what impact that had on democracy. Most countries before World War I were not democracies. They were monarchies or semi-constitutional monarchies. And then after World War I, we see this sort of like wave of democratization through the major European powers. And I think that had more of an impact on the trajectory of the 20th century than World War II did. And of course, if World War I had a different conclusion, there may not have been a World War II with all those countless lives. And maybe if the UK had remained neutral, maybe there wouldn't have been a Bolshevik revolution. Maybe there would have been, a democratic revolution in Russia. And you could imagine, the history of Eastern Europe being very, very different to what it was.
It's always fun to play hypotheticals, Jesse.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I'm very interested in this 19th century, early 20th century period where Australia's democracy, of course, is developing, as are the other democracies in the Anglosphere. You think of everyday people who were, citizens who were learning that, suddenly we have a secret ballot and, suddenly, voting's compulsory and, now I can vote. I used to not be able to vote. These are quite dramatic changes to the way people's experience democracy. What do you think it was that underpinned the Anglosphere's strength in democracy during that period? Was it the British inheritance and British roots?
So the thing with the Anglosphere's sort of democratization is that it happened, at different paces within different nations. So it happened obviously much faster in the US, Australia, and New Zealand than it did in Canada and the UK. In Canada and the UK, it wasn't until 1918 and 1920 that we see universal male suffrage, whereas, in the Australian colonies, most Australian colonies had universal manhood suffrage from the mid-19th century in 1856, if my memory serves me well. So it's different stages. What I would say that sort of makes the Anglosphere unique is not so much like its pace of democratization, but its political culture, its individualism. And that sort of goes back to, Britain as an island, and then to the different parts of the Anglosphere being geographically protected by various natural elements. So if you look at, the history of Britain, after 1066, there was only one successful invasion, and that was, of course, the Glorious Revolution. But that was largely, British elites inviting the Dutch to invade, and it was largely seen as a bloodless revolution. So we've had like 1,000 years, in Britain at least, of continuous, relatively stable political order. And so we were able to, and I say we because our political culture stems from there, we were able to think more about, reform internally rather than protecting ourselves from external threats. Sometimes there were those threats, like the Spanish armadas, but generally speaking, the English Channel and the North Sea really protected Britain and allowed it to evolve socially in a much faster pace. For instance, think about when the British had their revolution versus when the French had theirs. It's about 150 years apart, but they're very similar in some ways, okay? The wars of the Three Kingdoms, they take place between 1639 and 1653. The French Revolutionary Wars and the Napoleonic Wars, 1.5 centuries later, they both follow a similar trajectory in that, there's a regicide, there's an experiment with democracy, or some level of democracy, I should say. And then, a dictator, a strongman comes in and and puts a stop to that, Cromwell or Napoleon. But we see that sort of delay on the continent at every stage in terms of industrialization and other major milestones in civilizational development. So the Anglosphere has always been ahead of the curve. That may be changing now, but I mean, historically that's been the case.
What I find interesting is how, I guess, innovative Australia, or the colonies of Australia, but then after Federation Australia was with its democratic project. So in order to curb bribery, the secret ballots first legislated in Tasmania and South Australia, and it's so unique and curious, the secret ballot, and can you believe that now? It's called the Australian ballot.
In the United States.
And it takes 22 years to be taken up in the UK, and it takes 38 years for it to be taken up in the United States, and it really just transforms electoral integrity. It's something we take for granted now. Other things like, yes, universal manhood suffrage, but you think of female suffrage introduced in, yes, I know New Zealand gets first in, but introduced in South Australia, right? An Australian colonial innovation.
I know that the New Zealanders are really proud of, they say that we were the first nation, in 1893 to give women the vote, but the thing is, they weren't a country back then. They were a colony. They weren't even a dominion. They didn't become a dominion until 1907. So they weren't the first country to give women the vote. And in fact, they had the same status relative to the metropole as the territories in America had to Washington, D.C. And the territory of Wyoming gave women the vote in 1869, 24 years before New Zealand. So actually, if we're going to sort of take off our hats to one of the Anglosphere jurisdictions, it would be Wyoming, not New Zealand.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Well, we'll say congratulations to Wyoming. But what was it about the British Empire and adjacent, of course, with the United States, but what was it about the way democracy was evolving within the Anglosphere that led the other countries to adopt it? Because, Britain may very well have just seen, these Australian colonials, they have all these experiments with secret ballots and female suffrage, but it's not for us. But they obviously didn't take that view. They saw benefits in what was happening in Australia and elsewhere.
They were laggards in democratisation. They only really democratised fully after the First World War, which was when, most European countries did, and Canada was a bit of a laggard as well. I guess the question is what made, Australia and the US so unique? And I think it has something to do with our frontier heritage, the fact that we didn't have the old social hierarchies of the UK, and there weren't, various entrenched interests that wanted to maintain their privilege. And so there was more fluidity in our political and social dynamics in the 17th century United States, because you have to remember that even in the 1600s, they were moving towards democracy in the 13 colonies, or particularly in the northern ones. And in Australia in the 19th century, well before the UK. Canada's an interesting case because although it was a colony, or a number of colonies before Confederation, basically the people that colonized Canada, at least Anglo-Canada in very large numbers, were Tory loyalists who opposed the Republic. So they had a different sort of political culture that was more hierarchical than the typical American. And that's why that particular culture was kind of late to democracy relative to, say, Australia or New Zealand.
Something you've looked at is the contemporary issues at Anglosphere, and I think more broadly, democracies are facing around political polarisation, declining membership of political parties, declining trust in democracy as a best form of government, but also declining trust in the institutions that underpin democracy. Why do you think we have observed this phenomenon? And do you think it's a recent phenomenon? Maybe it's just the ebbs and flows of democracy and we should just shrug our shoulders and say it's fine.
There's no guaranteed good endings. Let's just say that. We are at a major inflection point in our history, but also, obviously broader Anglosphere history and broader, Western and global history as well. We've got major challenges ahead of us. Climate change is ramping up. I mean, we can see it year to year here, and we've got the rise of AI and job displacement, which is already happening to some extent, but will be like a major story in the next 10 years. And, we've got this populism and this multipolar world. Now, in terms of, polarization and extreme right-wing populism and where this sort of stems from, I would say that this comes from 40 to 50 years of neoliberalism. There were some good things with neoliberalism. I think that in the 70s and so on, we'd sort of hit a roadblock with the Keynesian Bretton Woods kind of economic order, and we needed something new. So we had Thatcher, we had Reagan, then we had Longy in New Zealand, and Hawke and Keating here, and we saw some efficiencies and so forth. But with that came this very slowly, because culture changes over generations and time spans of decades, not just years and such. So you might see some initial benefit, but the costs, came later, particularly as inequality rose. Inequality is very socially corrosive, but not only that, the emphasis that neoliberalism places on competition above all else and materialism, that sort of separated us from our fellow citizens, made us feel atomized. And then on top of that, we had the left in the various countries sort of pushing back against cultural institutions and national pride and so forth. And we had the culture wars and such. And so then we're not getting a sense of, nationalism, which actually is a very important force in the world, whether it be more of a local nationalism like being South Australian or Australian, or a broader Anglosphere nationalism. There is a kind of important binding dynamic to that makes us less selfish and gives us the political capital to build the welfare state and make sure that everybody feels like the system's working for them and their families. And over time, neoliberalism has really made us sort of individualized society, atomized society. Enemy, I think is the term used by sociologists to describe when social norms break down, when there's sort of a lack of community feeling. And it was best summed up by Margaret Thatcher. She said, "There is no such thing as society," meaning to her, we had moved beyond society. We progressed beyond society. But that's a very socially corrosive. And actually, it would make Benjamin Disraeli, her predecessor by 100 years, roll in his grave, because he was very much of the view that society was very important and that the palace is unsafe if the cottage is unhappy.
So your argument is that it is the sort of free market economics,
yes,
the sort of prioritising competition over looking after the broader society, the big welfare state, that has led to a corrosion in our democratic life, be that declining trust in government, lower rates, so not in Australia, of course, but lower rates of voter turnout, political party membership. To me, it seems to be drawing a bit of a long bow. I wonder if the critique is more to do with, we have had a tradition in Australia and across the Anglosphere of political imagination and creativity and democratic creativity and evolving our democracy. And in my lifetime, so since really the 80s, 90s, noughties and through to the 2010s, there hasn't been a lot of change in our political system, in our democracy. You're the expert. Maybe I'm missing something large. But, the way we vote, for me, always had compulsory voting, always had secret ballot. Of course, we've always had
a lot of those institutions are very important.
Preferential voting. Two-party system has been pretty solid until about 2016 when we started to see it fall away. And that independents have come and gone. I mean, I don't think we can say that independents are a recent phenomenon, but the primary vote of the two parties, as low as it is today, is something we haven't seen for
it's fairly new
80 plus years.
The non-two-party vote hit a low point kind of around 1975, so around the Gough-Whitlam dismissal. And then it started rising. And it rose, slowly at first, but it has been exponentially growing in the sort of early 2000s. And then in the last 4 or 5 elections, the non-major party vote has exceeded a third in each of those elections. So I think that's for the Senate. The House might be a little bit lower than that, but not by much. Yeah, I see what you're saying, that the political structure has remained the same. I guess what I'm saying is that the impact that neoliberal culture, or that economic model, has had on our culture takes, decades to come about. And we're starting to see that now with, the rise of One Nation. Now, it took us a bit longer than, say, in the UK with Brexit and Reform UK and Trump and so forth. And for about 10 years, we thought we were immune from that. That was a Northern Hemisphere thing. That wasn't us. But, now it's very much in force, and we're in the same boat as the larger two Anglosphere countries.
Is it not though, potentially... You could read Brexit and the rise of Donald Trump, who, basically took over an established political party, the Republican Party in the United States. His political movement, MAGA, just owns it now. And in Australia, the rise of the minor party and the decline of the two parties. I mean, perhaps these are rather than expressions of a dissatisfaction or an endpoint manifestation of neoliberal culture, whatever that means. Perhaps this is Australia and other Anglosphere countries going through the process to get to the next democratic transformation. So, repudiation, for example, of transnational government, that we want our sovereignty reasserted, that we want more control over our own democracy rather than this sort of networked democracies that the EU promotes and that global government and international conventions and treaties promote. That the Anglosphere is saying, what? No, we're done with that project, and actually we want to sort of reshore all our democratic rights.
Yeah, I think that there is a reaction, certainly, to the status quo. I think that people don't vote for parties like Pauline Hanson's One Nation because they're happy with the status quo. I think they don't vote for Donald Trump because they're happy. They don't vote for Nigel Farage because they're happy. I think that they've put up with a lot for a long time. I mean, essentially the story is that, there have been winners and losers from economic globalization and freer markets and privatization and so forth. And there have been losers. And those losers have put up with a lot for a long time, but eventually they have reached a breaking point. I mean, I use the example, say, of my parents who, are liberal voters and would never dream of voting One Nation, but they're of that baby boomer generation that, did quite well from neoliberalism. And they sort of look around, they're like, I don't understand it, Jess. Like, we were less than 1 in 5 of the electorate that voted Liberal. Like, what's going on? And I'm like, Mum, this is a generational thing as well. This is very much a Gen X, a little bit less so Millennial and Gen Z reaction to what's been going on for decades. And, just because you're doing well and things have run fairly smoothly for your generation, that's not how younger generations are feeling. They're saddled with debt. It's very difficult to enter the housing market. Establishing a young family, is beyond most people. That's like, well, that's never going to happen for me. So there's a lot of frustration that has built up. And I think that it goes back to the fact that conservatism really changed during the neoliberal era. It took on a lot of liberal ideas about the individual, whereas conservatism before the 1980s was quite different. It was more about keeping society whole and about social cohesion. You can see that with Macmillan in the UK. You can see that to some extent with Menzies here and with Fraser. It was about making sure that groups didn't splinter off and feel like they were, not part of society and create their own subcultures in reaction to the mainstream. So a lot of this reaction, a lot of this emphasis on immigration now is that we've had all these strains on services and not enough housing and so forth and student debt. And then, we see hundreds of thousands of new migrants pouring in with which we have to share these scarce resources. And also we're taking in so many that it seems like they're not integrating into the mainstream culture. Liberals in the inner cities, are all for salad bowl multiculturalism. But regular Australians, those that live in the suburbs and those that are in precarious work and such, perhaps a little less well-educated as well, they're looking at this from a very different perspective. And so then you get someone like Pauline Hanson saying, I'm going to stop immigration. I'm going to have these very simplistic policies that everybody can understand. And she does, cut through. And the thing is, Pauline Hanson, we're almost lucky on the centre-right of Australian politics that the leader of What One Nation is Pauline Hanson, because she's not an effective politician. She's not a Nigel Farage. If we had Nigel Farage that's sprouting the policy stances that Pauline Hanson is, One Nation's primary vote would be 10 points higher.
I don't know, Jesse. I think she's a political survivor. Whether you agree with her or not is beside the point. She has showed amazing resilience through the highs and lows of elections. Her message has been persistent and consistent. And look, you might not like the way she speaks, but I think she cuts through. And in politics, that's basically 90% of the journey, right, is cutting through. So I can remember what she said rather than, a speech that the Prime Minister gave or the Foreign Minister gave, in one ear, out the other. Yeah. But Pauline Hanson has incredible cut through and consistency and resilience. And I think those things in politics in this climate, she's being rewarded for that because she's so different from the major parties, or as she would coin them, the uni party.
Yeah.
So, Jesse, in your research and your historical research, but contemporary research, you really have become attracted to what's called One Nation conservatism, which is a British tradition. So the Conservative Party in Britain has sort of two...
Red Toryism.
Yeah. So, and has two strands. I guess there's the free market Margaret Thatcher version on the right of the party, and then there's the One Nation conservatism on the left of the party. So you'd say maybe a David Cameron would have been a One Nation conservative.
Yeah. His economic policy wasn't really One Nation. I think that some of his social policy and his rhetoric was, certainly the way that he framed his support for same-sex marriage was very One Nation. He said, I don't support same-sex marriage despite being conservative. I support it because I am conservative. And that really goes back to what One Nation conservative is all about, is social cohesion and keeping all the different parts of society together. The idea that we're all in this one organism. If I cut my hand, I don't say, my hand is hurt. I'm hurt because my hand is hurt, right? We're all part of the same body. So that's very what One Nation. I think that Boris Johnson, economically speaking, was far more One Nation than Cameron. But go on.
And you see One Nation conservatism as an antidote to, say, reform in the UK, or if transplanted to the Australian context, a rebuttal to One Nation, the political party in Australia, a bit confusing.
Which is not one way.
Yes. Yeah. It's sort of the big society. It's, a bigger role for the state in providing welfare and support.
We're seeing Andrew Hastie and some of the other Liberals sort of spruiking similar ideas, trying to ensure, secure our supply chains, make things domestically that are critical to our defence. I think that's all perfectly valid. And so he, to some extent embodies, a return to that sort of previous economic model a little bit, not all the way, but sort of. I think that the direction of both major parties will actually, and I know this sounds crazy at this point in history, but I honestly think that in 15 years' time, the two major parties will actually come closer together. We've seen greater polarization moving apart. I think that in the future, and we'll see this across the Western world, the left of politics will ditch kind of that cancel culture, woke ideology, and become a little bit more culturally conservative, may, lean into a little bit more nationalism and monarchism and so forth. And I think that the right is going to become more economically interventionist. And there was a similar period after World War II where, if you look at the policies of Eisenhower versus Truman, they weren't that different. And you can see that also in Attlee and Churchill. I mean, Churchill didn't roll back the NHS. He actually poured money into it and expanded the welfare state. I suspect that particularly if there is a major global conflict, which is not a minute chance at this point, I think that conflict is the incubator of community sentiment, and we will probably see a more conformist, community-oriented culture shortly after that, whatever's coming. But
it's interesting. I mean, it's an interesting hypothesis. And, look, they say that predicting the future is a game for mugs. And, good luck, Jesse. But there's an argument to be had that Menzies, when he came to power in 1949, inherited and took forward the Chifley government agenda. He certainly didn't on bank nationalisation, but, he stuck with the post-war migration program. He stuck with Snowy Hydro. So there was a lot of continuity, but also some ruptures, particularly actually around rationing and these sort of economic
Absolutely.
structures. But look, I think interesting idea. We will be able to hold you to it because this is recorded and in years to come we can see if you're right or not. But thank you, Jesse, so much for joining me on Afternoon Light. It's been a really interesting discussion.
All right. Thank you, Georgina.
History matters because ideas matter. Thank you for listening to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. To follow more of our work, subscribe to the podcast and visit robertmenziesinstitute.org.au. I'm Georgina Downer. Until next time.